All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to spend a little bit more time on Unit 3, having to do with culture, particularly having to do with languages. And I'm going to talk a little bit about languages. I'm also going to walk through a practice extended response question that the College Board sent out that will look similar to the types of questions you will see this year. And we'll go through that. It has to do with languages, so we'll go through that one today as well. I'm not going to have as long a video as yesterday. I just want to make sure we go through this unit in enough detail that you guys will be good to go for the test. Just want to kind of talk about what's going to happen on your test day. I will be doing, basically, since we can't meet up in person to do a review like I always do the night before our AP tests, I'll be kind of setting up a Google Meet that day. Your AP test is at 4 o'clock. So you should be able to, I'll set up a Google Meet sometime around noon and just kind of hang out there for 3 hours or so. And if anybody wants to jump on, ask any questions, you can do that, and we'll walk through that. I do want to go over a couple things real quick. Just one real quick thing about the AP tests. Some information that I got from Mr. Summer, which he may have shared this with you guys already. I'm not sure what he sends to you and what he just sends to the teachers. There is supposed to be either yesterday, Monday the 27th, or today, Tuesday the 28th. You should be receiving an email about test day information. So whatever email you use to set up your AP account, you need to check that email. It's going to have information about the test day experience. It's also going to have a guide to what they call a guide for test day, your at-home testing guide. That is going to have some very, very important information on it for you guys that you need to make sure that you read, because I want you to make sure that you know what you can and what you can't do on the test, what you can and can't get away with in terms of using materials and things like that. It's also going to give you an opportunity in the next week or so to test what the test will look like. So on test day, you're going to be emailed a code that you need to go out and enter, and that will take you out to your test. The test will be timed. Everybody will start at the exact same time. They will end at the exact same time. So if you finish early, you have to sit there. It's one of those things where everything's going to be timed. So they're going to give you some information about how you can access that. On Monday, May the 4th, what I'm going to use that day for is during our video time here, I'm going to have you actually do this. You're going to have the opportunity to practice test simulation on a demo site. So they're going to have a demo site set up. They're going to email you a code next Monday, and they're going to be able to go out there and make sure that this works. It is absolutely imperative that if you are taking this AP test, that you go out and make sure this stuff works before test day. Okay, you all have devices with your iPads. Obviously, if you're more comfortable using your computer at home, you can definitely do that. But don't be emailing me, please, the day of the test at 3:59 saying I can't get on the website, okay? Because they are making this available to you with all of this practice stuff. It is imperative that a lot of you go out there and check this, please, 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 okay? Very, very important. So please check the email that they should have sent you. If you do not have it in your email today, please check throughout the day today. The information that we have says that it was going out to students on the 27th and 28th, which would have been yesterday and today. So hopefully you have that information. They have set it up. If you did put your Northmont email in as your preferred email, Northmont has supposedly set it up so that you will be getting emails through from the College Board. Though if they use a different email address, I cannot promise you that is happening. So if that is the case, please let me know. I will pass that information along. The day of the test, you will be able to access your test through AP Classroom as well. So as long as you get an AP Classroom, you should have access to that. I know a couple of you have had trouble with that as well this year. So if you can't get into AP Classroom and you can't get an email from the College Board, you're not going to be able to take the test. So I know some of you have struggled with some of that this year. If you don't remember your password, you don't know what you're supposed to do for AP Classroom, you got to get on the phone to the College Board. The sooner the better, because we're now 2 weeks out, less than 2 weeks out from the test day. Okay, all right. what I want to do today is I want to spend a little bit of time on language just to do a quick refresher here. And I started here again with the unit at a glance thing that we kind of looked at yesterday that has the different subtopics. And I really want to pay attention today to the suggested skill section as to what students should be able to do. And this was really written for us as teachers, but one of the things that you can see here is what students are expected to be able to do related to each topic. So if you look down at 3.7, which is diffusion of religion and language, it says explain how maps, images, and landscapes illustrate or relate to geographic principles, processes, and outcomes. And what we're going to see today in the practice question that they gave us is that we're going to have a graphic, kind of like you would see on the AP test this year, with a bunch of questions having to do with language and kind of forcing you to understand what different terms mean. So we'll kind of walk through that here in a second. Let's go real quick to the PowerPoint first. And I want to start with the big concept here, which is the difference between language families, branches, and groups. Now, really, and just to be very blunt here, as long as you can identify certain terms as a family or a branch or a group in some sense, you will be fine. Okay, so language families, okay, are big language families. Okay, and I'll kind of fast forward to this here. The big one is Indo-European. Okay, so this is what all of our languages with common symbols, letters, things like that. So English, Spanish, German, French, Portuguese, Swedish, Norwegian, things like that. Those are all Indo-European languages. Okay. In addition, some of our languages from India, okay, are Indo-European languages, not just from India, but Nepal and places like that. So parts of South Asia. Sino-Tibetan languages are our languages such as Mandarin Chinese and some of our other languages that are spoken in China that tend to use symbols instead of necessarily letters. So there's going to be different characters that are used by our Sino-Tibetan languages than what we would see used in our Indo-European languages. And then we have the other language families, which are much more minor. Big thing here, if you see Indo-European or Sino-Tibetan, you're going to know that that is a language family. Now, language branches, okay, and if you look at, also I'll use English as an example. English's language branch is a Germanic language. So English is a Germanic language. So is Swedish, so is Norwegian, things like that. Now, there are other languages. German is a Germanic language as well, obviously, given the name there. Then we have some of our other languages. If you look at languages such as Portuguese, Spanish, French, things that are very similar to each other. These are what we call Romance languages, and that would be the branch that they fall into. So these are the Romance languages, kind of like we're in the Germanic languages, they're in the Romance languages. So that would be their language branch. And what you see with branches is that you start to see some more similarities between what we see within the language itself. And I'll kind of fast forward to this, and you can kind of see, I know this is kind of hard to see here, but you can see our Germanic languages kind of breaking off here, English being the biggest one, German, and then when we get down to our last piece here, so let me go up here real quick and I'll come back. Our third part here is language groups, and this is kind of our kind of subset of the branches. So you can see that Germanic is a branch here. Off of that, we have Northern Germanic, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and then we have Western Germanic, which would be English, German, Dutch, things like that. Then we have our Romance languages, and what you can kind of see on this branch here is that the closer these languages are together, the more similarities they're going to have. So obviously Spanish, French, Portuguese are all kind of clustered together. Those are Romance languages. Oftentimes the words that you see in those languages are very similar to each other. Okay, Balto-Slavic is another language branch. And then you have your groups off of that, which are Eastern Slavic, Western Slavic, South Slavic, things like that. Big idea here. If you hear Germanic languages, or if you hear Romance languages, okay, that is not a language family, okay? That's going to be, I'm sorry here, let me get the PowerPoint to work. That's going to be a language branch. So families, Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan. Branches, Germanic, Romance languages. Now, chances of them asking you a group are going to be slim because the groups are like Western Germanic or Northern Germanic, things like that. They're not going to ask you that. They're probably not generally going to ask you, particularly since there's no multiple choice part to your test this year, what something would fall into, though they could. There's one question on the sample thing that they gave us today, which is very Googleable. So I I would assume they wouldn't ask you this, but I can't say that for certain. So just make sure that if you hear that, you know these commonalities here. So if you see two languages that are in the same group, not only are they using the same letters, but oftentimes the words look very, very similar to each other. If you look up just 10 random words in Spanish and French, what you're going to see are they're going to look very, very similar to each other. And that's because they're in the same group. So the closer you are to each other, or the farther down that you go from family to branch to group, the more commonalities there are going to be between these languages. So that's kind of the big idea here. Almost half the world speaks an Indo-European language. Another 21% speaks Sino-Tibetan, so 2/3 of the world's population falls into those languages. Again, I will stress from our thing earlier this year, do not say Chinese is a language. It is not. Mandarin is the most widely spoken language in the world. It's official language of China and Taiwan, but there are many, many other dialects of Chinese. So we have Cantonese being a big one. Hakka, Min, Wu are all other Chinese languages. So please don't say that Chinese is a language, because it's not. Make sure you know the term logogram. Logogram refers to the symbols that you see in some of our Asian languages that represent words rather than sounds. So logograms are very common in Chinese languages, as well as some other things that you'll see there. Languages with at least 10 million speakers. And again, this is really going to be important for the perspective of our lingua francas, which we'll get to here in just a second. But when we talk about lingua francas, that you're going to see areas of the world where you see a lot of different languages spoken. So if you look at the northern portion of Africa, you're going to see a lot of languages spoken by some of the native ethnic groups that live in certain areas that are not Arabic. But Arabic is spoken for the purposes of business in those areas. Mandarin, obviously in China, the vast majority of China on this map is Mandarin, is shown as the primary language. But we have all of those other dialects of Chinese languages that are spoken there as well. But Mandarin will also oftentimes be used as the lingua franca. So we see these widely spoken languages, and they fall into these language families that they kind of we broke down for us before. I want to touch on a couple other things just as a point of refresher here, and again, I don't think they're going to get super detailed here into the pieces, just because of the fact that there's no multiple choice part this year. So I'm really focusing on kind of the big ideas here. Diffusion of languages very much spread from the same way that religions did yesterday. So we looked yesterday at how religion spread, all kind of spreading out from the Middle East. And we talked about earlier this year these two theories of how languages spread, particularly the Indo-European languages, starting here kind of just north of the Caspian Sea, or starting down in Turkey, wherever it happened to start. And again, we don't know, because this is thousands and thousands of years ago. And you can see in the second map here, sedentary farmer, it kind of spread to the area north of the Caspian Sea. But what you can basically see is that the commonality between religion and language is that they start from a hearth, wherever that place happens to be, and they spread out from that place. So obviously the Indo-European languages spread east and west. Which is why we see, obviously, Indo-European languages spoken in places like India and Iran and places like Afghanistan, as well as all throughout Europe. So whichever hypothesis happens to be right. Now, this one here doesn't have as much coverage into Asia as some of the other, as the other projection does. But again, the big idea here is that you start from a hearth, and this is the way everything diffuses, is you start from a hearth and you kind of spread out from wherever that place happens to be. Couple other vocabulary terms here I want to pay attention to. A dialect, regional variation of a language, so places where they may spell things a little bit different than they do in other places. Obviously, if you look at American English versus British English, you'll see a lot of differences here. They oftentimes will put U's in certain words, like humor. We'll have H-U-M-O-U-R in Great Britain, something like that, where it's not like that in the United States. Isogloss is kind of the boundary where word usage changes. So we did that thing in class where we talked about where people say pop versus Coke versus soda, things like that. Kind of the boundary lines on those maps are known as an isogloss. So that would be something that's important there. To make sure you know that, here's kind of what I was talking about there. This would be something that you might see on the AP test. You might see this being something that would be your stimulus that they give you for a question, and then they might ask you for the word that kind of describes the boundaries between these places. And that may not be something that's easily Googleable, which is what they're going to be. The way they may describe it to you may be in such a way that it may be hard for you to look something like that up. So again, you've got to know these things. And again, I'm going to show you the example they sent out here in a second. But one of the things that I want to stress is that if you're just looking up definitions and you and somebody else find the exact same definition and you use the same words, then what you could see is that there's a you could both get dinged for cheating if you're using the same terminology. So I'll go over that here in a second. But again, looking at these vocabulary words, you got to kind of be able to describe them and what those words mean. Couple other things I wanted to go over, and we'll be done here. Creole languages, really important to kind of look at Creole languages, because you're going to see these a lot in different places. So if you look at a Creole language, okay, and compare this to what we call a pidgin language. So if you remember when we talked about this earlier this year, you have these two things which are very, very similar to each other. A Creole language is kind of a blended language of a place. So a Creole language is something that will have native speakers. It's some sort of a mixed language that's kind of evolved over time, and it's usually going to be the language of a colonizer mixed with whatever the indigenous language happens to be in a certain area. So particularly in the the Caribbean Sea, you see a lot of Creole languages, particularly in places like Haiti, where you had the French colonized and they had their indigenous language there. So Haitian Creole is very, very common language there. So Creole languages have native speakers, and they're passed down from generation to generation. Pidgin languages do not. Pidgin language is just simply a simplified form of speech that's kind of formed out of one or more existing languages. And an example of a pidgin language would be something like Spanglish, is that nobody speaks Spanglish as their native language. It's just people who kind of use different terms that may be common to different things like that. So Creole versus pidgin languages, you should know those terms, because you're gonna see that. So if you look at Creole languages, these blended languages that you see, but that have to do with colonization. If you remember back to yesterday, this is very, very common with one of our terms that we looked at for religion. Okay, so if you look back and kind of compare these two chapters, and you look at our blended religions, you're going to see kind of the same idea here. So again, looking for commonalities within these two chapters is going to be important. So I think that's really where they're going to get you in terms of being able to make connections. We talked about a couple of examples earlier this year as well of some countries that do language diversity really well and some countries that do it very poorly. Belgium, if you remember, we have these two regions of Belgium, Flanders and Wallonia, that essentially do not get along well because they both speak a different language. There's a lot of tension over language in Belgium, particularly the fact that one of the regions is very, very wealthy and the other one is very poor. Then you have countries like Switzerland that do it really, really well, where you have 4 distinct languages, and like you see there, you have these road signs where things are written in 4 different languages, despite the fact that if you look at this map here, Romanche is spoken by not that many people, and that German is widely spoken throughout the majority of the country, but they still have recognition of these other languages in Switzerland. And then you have countries like Nigeria, where there are hundreds or maybe 1,000 languages that are spoken, where this is really what necessitates the need for a lingua franca to be able to communicate within a country. So lingua francas are really, really important for the purposes of business. Last big term before we get to lingua francas is isolated languages. There are certain languages in the world that are surviving solely because they're isolated and they're kept away from other languages that may try to kind of invade and force them out. The best example of this would obviously be the Basque language. The Basque people live in the Pyrenees Mountains, the mountain range there between Spain and France. They're very much isolated, and they speak a language that has a lot of differences from Spanish and French. And they speak that language, and it is different because they're isolated. So that has allowed them to preserve their language over time and has really protected their language from extinction. And then lingua francas, obviously, English is kind of the world's lingua franca, but you should also kind of know the lingua francas in other places. So obviously Mandarin, widely spoken throughout China. Swahili is spoken in a lot of our East African countries. Arabic, spoken widely in our North African countries. Hindi, spoken throughout a lot of South Asia. So you see these languages that are spoken in places where you have a lot of different languages that are there. Obviously, English has become the dominant language of the world for a few reasons, one being the internet, but primarily before that, it was the fact that the British colonized the vast majority of the world, and because of that, they spread English all over the place. So English is spoken as the primary language of a lot of different countries around the world. So this is something where I think English is, its role is really key in the world in terms of the purposes of business. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to put up this extended response here real quick, and this is from this is a practice question that the College Board sent to me to use to kind of show you an example of the types of questions that they're going to ask on this year's AP test. So this is an unreleased question. That is something that they've sent out just solely for this year's test. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I'm going to put this up on the screen here. If you want to, and I strongly recommend you do this, pause the video here, kind of work through this and see how you could do. Now, obviously, if you had this on test day, this would be an example of one of the 15-minute questions. Now, you can see here that there are 7 parts to this question. So if you walk into this test and you have no idea what any of these terms mean, you haven't studied, you haven't prepared, can you really look all of this up in 15 minutes and be able to write something and be able to put something down if you don't know anything coming in? And the answer is probably not. Okay, so take a minute here, pause the video, see if you can answer these questions, and then I'll go through the answers with you here in a second. All right, so here we have 2 charts. One is the Americas and one is Africa. And it basically shows you loss of indigenous language in the Americas and Africa since 1970. Okay, and it gives you some information. So if you read the chart there, read the description there at the bottom, it says the graphs show the current status of indigenous languages in the Americas and Africa as tracked since 1970. Vulnerable languages have a decreasing population that speaks the language. Endangered languages have a small number of speakers who are limited to small communities. Critically endangered languages have only a small community of speakers who remain. Okay, so part A, define the term indigenous language. Now, this would be the part that you could look up, but I will tell you this, that if I have 47 students taking this test, if 47 of you go to Google and you type in indigenous language and you come up with a definition, and 2 of you use the same definition, they're going to void both of your tests. Okay, so you need to make sure that you know what the terms are. And if you do look something up, whether it be in the book or whether it be in some other way, that you're putting things into your own words, okay? Because they're going to be very, very hard on this, okay? I cannot stress this enough. In all of their webinars and all the things they've been doing with us teachers, they're saying, we are going to crack down on students who have no knowledge of this topic being able to pass this test, okay? So you have to be able to put this into your own words and know it, okay? So indigenous language, any language that's spoken by original inhabitants of an area prior to colonization. Okay, so it's the language of inhabitants of a group of people whose territory has been colonized by another group. Okay, so if you look at the United States, okay, what are our indigenous languages? Well, these are all of our Native American languages. Okay, that's really the big thing here. This is why we have so many languages that are either extinct or critically endangered or endangered because we have these Native American languages that exist. Okay, now, part B, describe the types of physical regions where indigenous languages are most likely to survive. Well, we just did this when I went through the PowerPoint. Okay, I said the area where particularly isolated languages, if you look at an isolated language like Basque, okay, what allows it to be protected and not be overrun by Spanish or French? Well, they're isolated. They're stuck up in the Pyrenees Mountains, and they don't really come into contact with anybody. Another language that's isolated is Icelandic. Okay, they're on an island. They don't come into contact with anybody. So if you live in the mountains, if you live on an island, if you live in a heavily forested area, polar regions, things like that, you may not come into contact with that many other people. And because of that, that's going to protect you. Okay, now, key here, and I'm looking at the answer key while I'm showing you this. Describe the types, plural. Okay, so if you said mountainous regions, okay, not going to get you a point. Okay, types, plural. So generally it will give you something like give 2 or 3, but in this case it said types. So it's going to assume that you are going to read that as plural and be able to answer it appropriately. Okay, part C says describe how historically the political geography of colonialism has affected indigenous languages. Well, this is just forcing you to understand how colonialism works. Okay, so obviously when colonists come into an area, that they kind of marginalize these indigenous languages. Okay, if the British come into an area, we want you to speak English. You're going to speak English if you're going to do business with us, things like that. Colonial power oftentimes favors certain languages over others. Colonial education could be set up in an area. You could talk about that. Anything having to do with business or trade. Religious institutions could impose colonial languages. If you look at a lot of examples of that throughout history, where you see one primary language spoken in a region, it's oftentimes due to religious services being in that language, whatever that may be. But again, you could talk about any of those things. But again, if you understand that oftentimes when a region is colonized, the reason why someone colonizes a region is that they want to kind of impose their will on that area and take advantage of them for the purposes of business or trade, that would get you the point there. Okay, part D, explain how indigenous languages have been under threat from primary economic activities in the 1970s, in the Americas since the 1970s. Now, again, this forces you to make connections between chapters. What is a primary economic activity? So primary economic activity is anything that draws something from the ground. Okay, so it could be farming, it could be mining, it could be oil, anything like that. Now, let's look at how indigenous languages may be under threat from that. Okay, let's start with oil. Hey, we've done a lot of oil extraction from the lands of Native Americans, particularly in Alaska, First Peoples lands. We've taken a lot of that for the purposes of oil. We've done a lot of fishing there. We've done a lot of building of dams and things like that on the lands of indigenous people. As we come in, we kind of displace people the same way that we talked about gentrification in chapters in Unit 7 displaces people. Well, we do the same thing when we come in and take people's lands. Now, obviously, this says since 1970, but if you go way back to the Trail of Tears era, what did we do? We rounded up all of these different Native American groups who were all very, very diverse and had their own languages and their own everything, and we all forced them to go to Oklahoma and kind of integrate. You're all the same. Go be Native Americans in Oklahoma. Well, they were all different. They were different tribes. They had different languages. They had different customs and traditions, and we forced everybody kind of into the same place. Well, we're kind of doing the same thing now as we're doing some of these extraction industries, whether it be oil, natural gas, mining, fishing, anything like that, where we're forcing people from their lands. We're forcing them to disperse, go into other different places. Another thing we're doing is we're bringing in people to work in certain areas who may speak a different language. What have we seen in terms of farm labor in the United States since the 1970s? Well, a lot of it's been migrant farm labor from other countries who speak other languages. It's not just that they speak English and we're forcing English upon people, particularly in states like California and Arizona and Florida, Texas. We're seeing a lot of Spanish-speaking migrant workers who come over, and we have a lot of, again, if you look at these languages in the United States that are threatened, these are almost all Native American languages. Well, where are most Native Americans still clustered in the U.S. today? Well, it's in the southern states. So when we're bringing in Spanish speakers in addition to English speakers and things like that, this is another threat to languages that we see that are spoken in some of those areas. Part E, explain the degree to which globalization can explain the loss of indigenous languages. Well, again, a lot of these things are connecting very much to each other. But when you have things like the internet, when you have things like trade between countries, again, this is where you can work in the idea of a lingua franca. Okay, if we have all of these different Native American languages and these Native American tribes want to do business, they oftentimes have to learn English to be able to do business. Okay, so that's going to contribute to language loss. If indigenous peoples are going to use the internet, oftentimes you can go out to CNN's website right now and translate it into Spanish or translate. You're not going to be able to go out there and translate it into some of these Native American languages. They're not out there. So it really forces you, as the world becomes more interconnected, to speak one of these lingua francas, one of these languages spoken by a majority group, as opposed to continuing to speak minority languages. Part F, compare the data in the two graphs and explain why indigenous languages are less threatened in Africa than the United States. Now, this is not to say that languages aren't threatened in Africa, because they are. And the thing I really want to stress here is that we're really looking here at languages that are kind of on the verge of extinction. And if you look at a country like Nigeria, like we saw in the PowerPoint a second ago, they still speak 1,000 languages in Nigeria. Okay, and different ethnic groups. Remember, we talked about the fact that for certain countries in the world, ethnicity is more important than country, the nationality. So they don't really care. They don't have anything that binds them together as a country. They were just kind of thrown together by Europeans. So they're going to continue to speak their native language within their groups. In the United States, what we see with a lot of these Native American populations is that they have been integrated, in some cases, into American society, English-speaking American society. And then we see generations and generations and generations of Native Americans becoming less and less people with each generation, such that we have over 100 Native American languages that are spoken today that are on their last generation of speakers. So if you look at the United States, where we have this idea of nationalism, everybody is American, and I obviously we've treated Native groups very poorly in our country's past, but in the United States there's kind of this expectation that everybody speaks English for the purposes of business. If you go to Nigeria, obviously they have to speak Swahili in order to communicate with someone who doesn't speak their native language, but most people in Africa speak multiple languages. The vast majority of Americans don't. You can get away in the United States in a lot of places with knowing English and English only. There's a lot of places in the world where that's not the case. So you're much more likely to see languages on the verge of extinction here today, just as a lot of these ethnic groups start to die off and go away. Okay. And then finally, citing data in the graphs, explain how media and communications technology can be used to preserve indigenous languages. Well, you could say a lot of things here, but obviously, if we have the ability to record someone giving us definitions of words, things like that. A lot of these languages that are dying off don't have any sort of written tradition. And today, obviously, we have not only written tradition, but we have the ability with video and audio things to record speakers of different languages, giving us vocabulary for words and things like that, which will allow you to preserve a language over time, which we obviously didn't have 50, 60 years ago. So that's one of the things that will really save a language from potentially going extinct, is the fact that is that we have those different things to protect it now. We have different things that we couldn't use before in order to kind of save save what we know about different languages. Okay, now this is not a super difficult question, but what you can see here is this is a 7-part question with one stimulus. Okay, now granted there's 2 charts here, but it's basically one chart, essentially one concept here. This would be a 15-minute AP question. Okay, if you think you're going to answer this question in 15 minutes and look every single answer up on the way, you're going to struggle with that. Okay, so you need to make sure that you know at least enough of the concepts here to be able to answer these questions without having to Google every single thing or look up every single thing in your book or the packets I gave you, things like that. So this is why it's so critical for you to be at least refamiliarize yourself with the content. Okay, all right, tomorrow I'm going to go back to Unit 1. I'm going to start walking through some things with map projections and some other things there. Please, if you've not already done so, take a look at the free response reviews that I've put out on the website, out on AP Classroom. I've gone ahead and released all of the units, all of the free response questions, so you can take a look at all of those that are out there. Again, practice some of them. Okay, if you see multiple stimuli, that's going to be a 25-minute question. If you see one stimuli like this is going to be a 15-minute question. These are the types of questions you can expect to see on the test in 2 weeks. Okay, hope everybody has a great day. No writing prompts. I don't think I'm going to do that the rest of the year. I may ask you to communicate some things with me through the writing prompts, but you won't have any more specific writing prompts that we'll do for the purposes of these. That's all I have for you today. Please look for that email from the College Board that I talked about at the very beginning. Make sure you can get logged in and see what you need to see. Hope everybody has a good day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.